Okay, so I don't know the English language, unfortunately, but maybe it would have been a good idea for me to study English instead of color. I don't know. Thank you very much to the school for having me here. I have been related to the school since it started. And therefore, I started when your parents basically were born. I started already to work and be related with the school, to study. And thanks to the director of the school and thanks to the school, which still allows me to have a contact with this fantastic reality, this teaching and professional reality, I am happy to be able to see you 3 times, today, next Thursday, and the Thursday after that again. So we will have 3 meetings. And talking to Professor Massimo Caiazzo, just now, before we started the seminar, I can say that I was very happy to leave my testimony after about 25 years that I have been in the field to a person of such high professional quality and cultural quality as Professor Caiazzo, and also a person who has always highly respected me. So therefore I thank Professor Caiazzo very much. And I think that I can speak, and I spoke also with Professor Caiazzo about this. I think we will touch upon 3 topics in our 3 meetings. The meeting we have today will deal with a general overview of the problem of color and with how you can meet that problem in the textbooks, basic textbooks about color. That means we have to consider that this, as far as I'm concerned, is a basic color. Right? So we're not here talking about a color related to professionally, which you will be studying more closely with Professor Caiazzo, because I am more interested in mainly the theoretical aspects of color, both theoretical aspects of color, but also the ones of another subject that I have taught for a long time, which is geometry, descriptive and projective geometry. And I try to combine these 2 dimensions that fill my life. So today we're going to make a general overview. The next meeting, we're going to have a general view on the systems of color. So that means some of these systems, some of the systems of color, and we're going to try, without going too much into detail, which I'm sure some of you already know, or at least you will be able to know more in detail in your own studies, but I would like to give you a general overview, a general view of the systems of color and how they are related one to the other. The third meeting and topic will be a small application, a small use of these systems, and again this will be mostly on a theoretical level, so maybe a bit boring, and with reference to some considerations that have been made by some scholars, by some authors that are pretty important in the field of color. So we'll have a general trajectory in history through a historical overview about the relations that have been proposed by some scholars. So starting with our program for today, I can ask the first question. Do you think color exists? Yes or no? Do you think color exists? Yes.
No.
No, color does not exist. What exists is the concept of color, okay, the idea of color, but color itself does not exist. And I can maybe get close to the idea, maybe if I just write the word color and I say maybe blue. I'm not trained to speak in public anymore, I apologize. Therefore, I cough a bit. But anyway, if I write blue, green, yellow, these words, think about it for a minute. You would not be able to see it if you don't think about the color, right? You wouldn't be able to conceive it. So color itself is not really existing. The idea of color exists, and that is the point of view, for example, of Descartes. Okay, the second question I want to ask you is, do you think colors exist? Plural. Yes. Okay, so the color, one color, does not exist as an element because it's an abstract element, but colors exist. So that color, this color, that one, and so on. So colors that are linked to some kind of a reality, an objectifiable reality, okay, something we can objectify. That means that when we speak about color, we have to combine these two entities. The color as an idea, the color as an entity that you can find placed, located in space and in time. So that is colors, local colors. This means also period. So this means also that color doesn't exist, colors do exist, and therefore the problem of the relations between this visual experience and the material reality opens up, the material reality of objects. How many colors are there? This is like questions for you. Q&A. How many colors do you think there are? I think colors are as many as there are people who perceive them. One thing is color from the point of view of energy, electromagnetic energy, so wavelength, which again is objectively infinite, although the perception, our perception will select a very limited number of those, and therefore it is colors, we could say, are as many as there are people. So color is basically an individual experience. Okay, so therefore it is related to the characteristics, the perceptive characteristics and psychophysiological and cultural characteristics of each person, and of the same person also throughout time. The perception of color can change. And therefore, we have to put together these three different entities. Color, and as we think of it, so conceived color, color in objects, and color in its psychosensorial, we could say, variety. So this great variety of color can be reduced to some colors which are so-called primary colors, or the number, in any case, can be reduced, the number of these colors, to reach an acceptable quantity, acceptable for our experience and for our activity as human beings. So they can be reduced, the number of colors. But before I wanted to say something else, I wanted to ask you a different question. Do you think it's necessary to have a course about color? Why do you think we have a course about color? So I'm more and more worried that there are courses about color. It worries me. To me, it's worrying, because I'm almost afraid to speak about color. The older I get, the more afraid do I get. Because one of these evenings, for example, it happened to me that they called me up, they called me to go to the television, and there was a program on BBC about color, and it lasted 1.5 hours, where they did not give out a lot of news about colors, but let's say there was a huge abundance of teaching material in that program. So since I don't have a computer, and I lose my cell phone very often, and I only have a pencil and a piece of paper that I use to work with, and a problem. My problem is competing with this highly seductive technology, right? These highly seductive devices and also pleasant devices that exist in communication today. And I am very happy, I'm pretty happy that I find myself progressively at the margins, really, at the outskirts of this field, because that allows me to dedicate my time only to some intellectual pleasures. Well, maybe not intellectual, that's a big word, but anyway, mental pleasures, you might say. So, a course about color. Obviously, a course about color is useful for computers, for printing, for designing, but also it could be just for the mere pleasure of knowing something about this topic. And I always tell about this, I'm always mention this example, that geometry that I like to study, that I have been studying also for a long time. And I could also say architecture is useful, right? Geometry is useful and necessary for architecture. Architecture, in fact, cannot live without geometry, but geometry could live without architecture. Mathematics is also necessary for a great amount of human activities, but it could be pleasant also in itself. So as far as I'm concerned, I deal with color for the mere pleasure of dealing with color, and not because this could be useful or functional to other professional activities, which I think is your task, your professional task in your case in the future. And another image that I often show is this one. Which is again to show and motivate the reason for why you should have a course about color. Okay, you see, this is a diagram which indicates our effort, our mental effort, and where, let's say, our daily perception, what we perceive daily, sometimes we're a bit more busy, sometimes we're a bit more calm. Our daily activity is in between these two, in this small interval here, right? This is the wavelength that you can register depending on the type of activity that you have in your brain, depending on the type of activity you do during the day. Now, our daily activity lies within these two small lines here, and moving from there, you open up a whole trajectory, which is called ergotropic, and which takes up energy. It takes up a lot of energy. Or, on the other side, you have the trophotropic, which requires less and less energy. So this here is a state which we call the hallucinative stage, and this one is meditation, the meditational stage. Now the two trajectories are joined, the two parts are joined by this shape here, which is simply an 8 shape, so a circle that is twisted, and this is called the lemniscata. And if you look at physiology or the human anatomy, this is from the heart to the fingers for somebody who plays an instrument, for example, or how the muscles are placed in your body or how your gestures are, and all that is linked by and controlled by this little 8 shape here. But even if you have a body that is exploring a celestial body and comes back to the Earth, the trajectory it would fulfill is this shape. So we have the hallucinative or the exciting part on the left, and the right is the meditative, and it's linked by this curve, this H-shaped curve. And here you can imagine that all of these paths are linked together, and they're interdependent also from this. Now, the beginning of this trajectory, of this path, and here you see also of its complementary side over there, is linked by the creative aspect. And to promote the creative aspect, you need to stimulate the activity of making more sensitive. So, for example, a course of color has the specific function, apart from its operational application in the future in some profession, has the aim of making people sensitive towards color, because when you're sensitive, you can generate a project, an emotional state, a walk, or the enjoyment of a work of art or of a human relationship. This is the reason why I think it is correct that we have courses on color. So I was saying that the great variety of colors can be reduced to some situations which we could say are more primitive situations or primordial situations. So we have a reduction, which is first of all a technical reduction or technological reduction. You all know, I'm sure, well, most of you I think know this, these diagrams, these two images, which indicate this one is the synthesis, additional synthesis, which is what happens on the computer screen, for example, and this is what happens on print. These are opposed or contrary, because you see that the three colors, red, green, and blue, which here are primary colors, RGB, here become secondary in the print diagram. In fact, if the colors that are primary colors in the print, CMYK, are secondary in this first diagram. The three light rays that are projected one on top of the other will produce white, as we see in the center up here. The three filters, or the three inks that you put one on top of the other, or the three transparents, will produce, as we see here, or will cancel out, let's say, their presence and give rise to black. So all textbooks, or all books in general, textbooks on color, basic textbooks, illustrate these two situations. This is the starting point. So I talked, in fact, on another occasion with Professor Caiazzo, and I told him, I think I have some doubts about this being a reality, because the three light rays, colored light rays that we see, so the three projectors, one with a red filter, one with a green filter, one with a blue filter that we see up here, if they overlap 2 by 2, red by green, red plus green will give us yellow, green plus blue will give us cyan, and blue plus red will give us magenta. All three together, they say, will give us white. All textbooks will tell you that. And I just allow myself to say that they will give us white if the three rays that are projected are on a screen that is already white. Because if the screen were green, for example, then this would be green. And if it were blue, then the center would be blue. So let's say that it's more correct to say that the three rays of light that produce the so-called white light simply respect the objective reality of the situations, the visual situations that we have. But they do not produce white, right? Because the white is given Either because I have rotating discs with RGB points, so 3 colors, and I have them rotate, and therefore I'm looking at them while they're rotating, and they add up, and therefore I will obtain a certain kind of white, let's say theoretical white. Or it's the case of the white screen, so that when I'm looking at the screen and I see white, and when you go up close, you will notice that you have 3 dots inside the white, RGB, that repeat themselves, and in that case the screen will be black when it's off, and if I see it white, it's because objectively speaking the synthesis has happened. But if I project it onto a screen, it will give me white only if the screen itself is white. However, this is always the case. They always write this in textbooks. But another detail is that for technical reasons, the 2 diagrams, this one and that one, are placed on 2 parts of a page. And this also does not exactly allow you to perceive how things really are, because you should not conceive them as one in one position and the other in another position, below, above, left and right, but one behind the other. They should be placed one behind the other, so that the 2 elements will be seen among them as necessary and complementary. So there will be 2, the printer with the inks and the color that you obtain with lights, and it's necessary to have both of them for the relationship between matter and energy. So you have to think that the green is behind the magenta, and the cyan is behind the red. The yellow is behind the purple blue, okay, or violet blue. This you could say enriches this relationship between additive synthesis and subtractive synthesis, so between pigment and light, right? Between the 2 elements that make up also a great historical adventure of thought about color and about knowledge. Reality is always double. Right? Reality is always double. There's always one thing, and behind it there's another. And getting used to conceiving the world as being double, I think, really enriches our experience, our cognitive experience, very much. So, this is not everything. There is more. So again, the reality of one and the other, I repeat, it's clear that the reproduction here is not so great. You have to imagine what I'm saying a little bit, because it's even more bright, the color in reality. But let's say every translation is a treason, right? So these are the 2 elements that you should be thinking of as one behind the other, but just to repeat something which is important, you have to look at one from here and the other from there. So not one next to the other, but one behind the other. Okay? This is because there's this constant exchange between matter and energy. Okay? So I repeat, between light and pigment. And here, once again, I repeat myself, but it's just to make it clear, if this is a reality and the other reality is on the back and it's symmetrical, then when I flip the world, you will see that they are in a medium state, right? They're in an intermediate state, in the situation. And what's inside, of course, we cannot see, because inside something happens which is far away from our perceptive experience. We cannot see it, because in the center here, you should have a coexistence of both systems, this additive and subtractive system, one behind the other. And in this situation here of, how could you say, this situation of a cut, so to speak, something happens which is subtracted to our experience. So when you are doing operations of geometrical projections, you have to write on the vertices, you have to write A, B, C, D, and so on, because otherwise we will not know if that thing is something we're looking at from the top, from the bottom, from where. So if this, for example, were right flip, then if I look at it from below, it will be looked at from the left, right, from the other side. When it's at eye height, so at the height of the horizon, I cannot see anything. I cannot see what's inside, right? Because it's a reality. The reality is that two things cannot be at the same time in the same place, so it's subtracted. Just the same way that gray, for example, is not a mix of white and black, right? It's simply a situation in which two contrary values should be coexisting, and therefore they destroy each other or they hide reciprocally, so that gray is the state of the horizon where things coexist as a double. And in fact, also when you imagine, there's a small model that you can make to see this mechanism more clearly, but when you pass from this and you overlap it with that one, then there are two more possible syntheses, which is the one with the dots here in the print and the one that is made with the pixels in the screen, so in the digital. So the fact that you have these two techniques that are obtained by means of dots is a need that is linked to the fact that when I, from this situation, pass to the next one, to the one behind, then in the middle I have to have the double state. So basically, I should not start from the technology and see that there's a technology for printing and a technology for projecting on screen, but starting from the idea that if the world is double, then there is an intermediate state. And therefore, the pixels and the dots in the print are a need, are a consequence, let's say, and not they're an a priori need and not a consecutive need, so not something that comes after. So the reduction of the whole world of color fundamentally can be reduced to 3 plus 3. And another way of reducing color, so this is a technological reduction, but then we can also have, I'll just choose another example, I chose 3. We can have another type of reduction, which is anthropological. So the anthropological reduction of color. And this is the view of a very famous research, an anthropological research, which was carried out in the second half of the last century, where by analyzing the vocabulary and the operational ways of various different cultures in the world, I think they examined about 90 different cultures, so quite a lot, and they found out in this research, which was also very controversial, in fact, that all of the people all the cultures that have an extremely reduced and essential vocabulary, so a primary vocabulary, will have words for black and white. So the first two colors, if black and white, of course, are colors, if you want to consider them colors, you can look at the definition of color to see whether they are or not. However, all cultures in the beginning have words for black and white, so they distinguish from darkness and light. Okay? And another thing is black and white. So in all of we will always know that black and white are the two primordial values that all cultures recognize, right? So be or not to be, right? Black and white. And if a vocabulary or if a culture gets more advanced and more enriched, then the first color that they add to black and white is red, okay, in the vocabulary. So the cultures that have 3 words, or the civilizations that have 3 words for color, have the words black, white, and red. Okay, so red is almost also the very first, the pioneer of all colors, right, of all the hues that will come after. And as you can probably guess, it is probably the only color that you can apply the word language to. The other colors do not have languages, right? So, if going on, if a vocabulary or a culture has 4 words for color, they will be black, white, red, and here it wasn't certain if it was yellow or green. Okay, in some cases, some cultures it was yellow, some it was green. So these 2 were more or less together in the same place. And this way they went on in the research. And gradually, as the vocabulary increased and the expressive richness of a culture increased, also the number of colors increased. And at the 7th state, as you see, we also added these last hues, which were less essential, less primary, and less present in the cultures, in the origins of the cultures. So also this is an interesting research, an important study, because as soon as textbooks get a little bit more into detail with the study of color, they also present this diagram. This is very often quoted, so very famous also in all of the research. So technological reduction was the first example. This is anthropological reduction, and a third kind of reduction that we can mention, reduction in the number of colors, is the following, which is a psychophysiological reduction. Okay, you see this projected in this very poor way, and I will give them to you in a better format so you can have it more clear. However, these are the famous tests about colors that were carried out by Max Lüscher, and I don't know if some of you might have heard about these tests. Max Lüscher? Yes? No? Okay. So, according to these, to this doctor, he was a doctor psychologist, he was from Switzerland, half Swiss, half German. The colors, according to him, the fundamental colors in psychology or psychophysiology are 4. Here you cannot really see them too well. All right, here. He doesn't want to wake you up since some of you are sleeping, he said. Okay, these are the basic colors, according to this doctor. The basic colors in our psychophysical sphere. There are 4. Red, a green, somewhat like this green here. Then we have a blue, this blue, and a yellow. So red, green, yellow, and blue. Then, to analyze the psychological and psychophysiological aspects of people, there is a very, very commonly used test, which is the test invented by this doctor, which is done by specialized personnel and not just by amateurs as a game, party game. It has to be seriously done. There are two versions. The most commonly used is the following. There are 8 colors, these 4, and then to analyze especially the more physiological aspects, we have 4 more colors. So a brown, a gray, a black, and then there is a color, also this is a curious color for a reason that maybe we'll talk about, which is magenta. Okay, the color that separates these 3 from the first 4 is magenta. So according to this doctor, and he selected these 8 colors starting from a base of about 2,400 colors, and then reducing, gradually he reached these 8 fundamental colors for the psyche. And then there's another test which is a bit more complicated, and which is not, in fact, so commonly used. It's almost never used, never applied, where you don't have only one gray, but you have 5 different grays. And this is the test. The test about the 5 grays is always done a bit before the 8-color test, because it denotes basically if the person that is being tested is showing up for the test with a bit of worry or a bit of alert or not. So whether that person is worried about the test or not. Some people might say, yeah, well, who cares? And others might say, oh, I wonder what they're going to find out. So this indicates the level of tension that the person is suffering during the test. And then after that you have other colors. But the base is always the same concept. Here we have other colors that enrich the choice and the test a little bit. Now, these 4 plus 4 colors in the initial version of the test, according to this doctor and scientist, here you cannot see it very well, that's my fault, but anyway, the blue here and the yellow are called heteronymous colors, which means that they indicate 2 colors that are as close to white and black as possible. So they are the colors that we suffer in involuntary ways. For example, day and night is something we cannot change, right? It doesn't depend on us. We have to accept them. Pleasure and color are other things we cannot do anything about. So there are some situations that our perceptive system cannot control and that we cannot act on, if not in a very limited way. And this supposedly is linked to these 2 colors, yellow and blue. But red and green, on the other hand, are colors that are autonomous, independent. So people can actually decide if they want to be influenced by these colors or if they want to influence the world. And then after that you have various combinations between the 4, and these 2 and 2 and 2 and 2, diagonally, horizontally, vertically combined, can, if you are an expert in the field, if you deal with this professionally, for example, they say that this gives you results that, together with other tests and exams and results, that are very significant and can tell you a lot about the psychic and physical characteristics of people. Now, How do you do this test? Basically, you put on a table, you put these 8 colors down on the table, and then you tell the person, well, listen, you should not think about either your clothes or your shoes or architecture. You simply should think about a rectangular format like this, rectangular, and tell me which one of these colors you like best. All right, so just as a color, not in terms of shoes, clothes, or any other object. And the person selects whatever color, and you write the number down that's on the back of the color. And after that, you go on like that. Okay, now we only have 7 colors left. Which one do you prefer? Then after that, you only have 6. Which one do you prefer? And so on. Then, you chat in between one part of the test and the next. You wait a little bit, and then you say, okay, now we're going to repeat the test, considering that we are not doing a test about memory, right? So I don't want you to repeat your preferences, the preferences you told me in our first round. But you can also completely change your preferences, right? Then you write down the 2 rounds, the 2 sequences of choices, and then you make a series of operations on that I know just because I'm curious about it, but I'm not an expert in the field, and I don't deal with these tests myself, because psychologists use this and doctors do. They use this together with other tools to analyze their patients. Okay, so we started saying how many colors are there. We said that colors are as many as there are people. We said that a single person can also change their perception of color depending on situation during the day, on their age, on their position in life, and so on. All of this variety of colors can be reduced to some primary situations, we've said. One primary situation could be a technological situation, one anthropological, and the third we've mentioned is psychological, right? 3 ways of reducing the amount of colors, which I have selected to indicate our desire to reach, how could you say, to reach what Gate would call the prime element. And another element that is right, thank you. Okay, but this is simply a curiosity. Okay, here you see how these 4 colors are linked between each other by means of these arches that here you see, right? This is linked with that one, this is linked with that, and so on. So I repeated this small drawing in order to remind you that in history, in the history of the systems of color, the first color system was to put color in a circle. But there are at least 3 more systems where color have been ordered depending on here's Aguilonius, for example, depending on a way that reproduces this. So this is to insert also inside a model or in more than one model, graphical models or historical models, the way in which the 4 colors of Luscher are also related to a modelization of the world, in the world of color. So if you look up systems of color, you will find that in 1600 something, there was this way of relating colors between each other. And this is also repeated as far as Luscher is concerned. Or another model that I like personally is this organization of color. Okay, the four colors here are at the far ends, at the peaks of this triangle. Tetrahedron, it's called, tetrahedron. And the 6 situations that are produced, active, passive, ordered, disordered, aggregating, disaggregating, constitute the peaks, the various points of this tetrahedron. And the fact that you can link it to the tetrahedron, I think, is very practical, because the tetrahedron is the basic shape, it's the spatial quanton, right? So the tetrahedron is the spatial quantum. So if the first 4 make up the tetrahedron, the second 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, will be dual, right? Dual with the tetrahedron. And what does that mean, that they're dual? That each geometrical figure has its counter figure, and just one. So the cube is dual with the octahedron, octahedron with the cube, and they can be interchanged. Okay, the 6 with the 8, the 12 with the 20, and vice versa. The tetrahedron is exchanged with itself. Okay, the tetrahedron does not have a dual shape, does not have a second shape. It has its own shape inverted. So to make it dual, you have to join the centers of the facades. Right? So if you link the facades of the cube, you will have the octahedron. In this case, you will obtain an inverse tetrahedron. The dual of a sphere will be the sphere again, right? Which makes you think that the tetrahedron and the sphere are the extremes of the world of polyhedrons. So you cannot go any further. And that's because when you've reached the situation, the figure will invert itself. So, another element that is a general element in the field of color, which, however, I find not very developed in schools, but not even among experts, really, and among scholars of color, especially as far as the communication, the social communication of this element is concerned. So the public use, and therefore, for example, signage and children's books, where you also have certain rules about the choice of letters, for example, based on the age of the children, the type of lettering, the size of the font, and so on. There are certain rules. But another element that I would like a school to develop is this diagram here, which I remember I copied back in the day from a book which was partly translated into Italian, but in a very reduced and limited way, and it was called Sémiologie graphique, so in French, graphic semiology. And the text, the book was written by Bertin, and Bertin was the head of the Cartographic Institute in France, and map making, that is. And the interesting thing is that when you have a map, either a geographical map or a city map or whatever, what is the problem? That in that map you have to have the biggest possible number of information, so signs, without the signs disturbing each other, right? So the biggest amount of signs, biggest amount of information, but the smallest amount of noise between one sign and the other. And what does that mean? That you have to examine which are the alphabets, the graphical alphabets, you might say, of a visual communication. So here I added 2, not because the scholar who did this was not competent enough, but because I think that this model can also be extended to a three-dimensional field, not just to the field of two-dimensional graphics. So, for example, maps or graphics in general. So, let's say, if you have an image, any image, whether it's reproduced image or whether we're looking around us, then the great variety of elements that make up the visual field can be traced back to no more than 8 components. Okay. So no more than 8 components make up any image. And this thing made me very curious, because how many images do we have? Well, infinite amount, right? Even of one single object, we can go all around it, look at it from different points of view, and have almost infinite images of it. But the components, the bricks, so to speak, that make up an image are always only 8. And with these 8 elements, you can build up the great variety of the world, of images in the surrounding world that we see. And these 8 elements can be divided into 4 plus 4. So, instead of saying what the components are, we could also say, for what reasons does one thing distinguish itself from something else? So, how can we say that 2 things are 2 and not 1? Why are we sure that there are 2 different things? Okay, what elements allow us to say that? And here we enter another small field, which is what are the minimums. There are 5 of these minimums. There's the minimum visible thing, the minimum separable thing, the minimum alignable thing, the minimal growing thing, and the minimum movement. However, one thing can be, or one element can be distinguished from the next because one is bigger and another is smaller. Okay, so its size, first of all, allows us from a visual point of view to determine whether one thing should be read, at a certain distance. For a person, for example, who has a 7 or 8/10 vision, it has to have a certain size. Particularly ladders or whatever should have a certain size if you're standing away at a certain distance. Then, what I would like to do would be a nice research to see whether in social communication in a city, for example, with the same costs, how many mistakes you have and how difficult it is, especially for a foreigner, to be able to move with a certain ease inside a city. Right? Not even the subway line number 3 in Milan, which was born after our experience with the red line and the green line, not even that line is entirely free of certain mistakes, mistakes in terms of communication or design, which goes from the choice of color to the placement of the signs to the lighting. Now, for example, if you take the subway and you go to see to the station of Loreto, for example, in the subway, you will see that they on top of the platforms, right, on top of the platforms, they put in this element which is a bit zigzagging graphic element, and you will notice that that does not allow you to see, if not only once in a while, thanks to the placement of the lights, you will not be able to see the names of the sign, Loreto, right, the name of the station. That's the same thing that happens on the green line and so on. Same thing on the yellow line, where, I repeat, the size is very important. You have to be already at the station to be able to read the sign. When you know already from the traffic accidents and so on, that the most important thing is the notice beforehand, right? That's what makes traffic easier and more safe. The movement of people in general easier and more safe. So already, just based on the size and on the characteristics, of the element. Many of these writings, for example, are conceived to be seen from a 30-centimeter distance and not from, I don't know, a distance of 20 meters or something like that, right? So, and I think, because I am a bit a graphic designer in part, I think that the one at the airport, the signage at the airport of Malpensa is pretty good. The third element that they added, that third part of the building that they added, is very well conceived due to the color, the use of color, the contrasts, and the readability of the letters, the separation also between one letter and the next. All of this has been studied in a better way, I think, in my opinion. So, if I were to do a course on visual theory or something like that, I would take this table and I would examine it first just with in order to identify these elements, and then with a proposal to show how superficial designing of public spaces, for example, is, or anything that is socially useful, how many mistakes we make in that kind of design. So as you see, this becomes smaller and smaller, and here it becomes the minimum visible. Another element, a characteristic element, is the value. Okay, so two things will be the same size maybe, but one maybe is lighter and the other one is darker, right? So by value we mean, for example, light and dark. Okay, so the lightness and darkness is the most important element. Remember what we saw before, that anthropologically speaking, the first two colors for every culture were black and white. Okay, then we have grays as a combination between these two. So the most important thing also concerning this particular text, the most important thing due to which people choose one color rather than another is due to its being light or being dark, right? So you will choose blue before you choose it because it's blue. You choose it because it's dark, because it's calm, it's relaxing. It reminds us of these old armchairs, for example, the psychoanalysts. They're always dark leather, they're extendable, and you can sit and fall into them. And you will choose yellow because it's very light, right? Translated into black and white, it's very light, very luminous. So it's the value in terms of light and dark, the second element. A third element that will distinguish one thing from another is the transparency. Okay, so what are the laws of transparency? Well, that's what's so fascinating about transparency, because transparent things are always liked because they almost have a moral component as well. As if we don't have to be afraid of what lies behind. You don't have to hide and not subtract yourself. And I think that for some years, also in design of objects, also of products, transparency is very present, right? Transparency of objects or of plastic materials, maybe going from chairs to objects. So transparency is another element, another topic. And a fourth element that characterizes the diversity of two things that are the same size, the same lightness, the same transparency, but one is in one place of our visual field and then the other is in another place of our visual field. And here also, looking at the reading from bottom to top, from right to left, at the height of the horizon. So if you go from the center of Milan to look for the highway, a lot of the signage you will see is at the height of cars, right, at the level of the cars. So if you have another car in front of you, you won't see the sign and then you won't turn. So, obviously, you will still make it somehow to the highway, but why should you force people to become irritated and nervous and to have tense behavior when it's so easy to put a sign at a different level, right? Because we're no longer walking today, and maybe even bikes, we're not using them either. So the means that we're using, the means of transportation, also force us to design in a different way than we did in the past, right? Signage in the past did not consider these things.
I just want to say that what he is saying is completely right. Can you imagine, in the yellow line, a lot of people miss the stop. They can't see. So this is even losing time, money, and the statistic. They don't know why, but the people feel lost in the yellow line. You know why? Because they write the graphics with the white color on the yellow. Can you imagine? This is a big, big mistake. And with the mistake of a designer, you get many, many delayed mistakes and losing money. This is the real ecological thinking, is to do right project, to serve the people, not to put it more complicated.
He didn't understand, so he needs a translation. Right, exactly. I was about to say that. White on yellow, right? So the problem of contrast is also very important. So there is an aspect of color which is ergonomic, and that's what you can control, right? As opposed to other aspects which are more anthropological or psychological or cultural or semantic aspects. Here we're talking about something that you either see or you don't see. And that's the difference between visibility and readability, right? These are two different levels of communication. So when to say, for example, if a letter is a Q or a C or an O or a G, between these four letters, I have to be able to see the details, right? The detail has to be 1/5 of the whole height of the letter. These are things that just belong to a physiological optic that we live with as human beings, right? So it wouldn't be so difficult to apply these things that we all know, they're commonly known, but that I don't know, who designs these things, where. He was saying that where people get most lost in Milan is on the yellow subway line. Yes, exactly. So for the yellow line, right, if you see from the stop at Duomo and you get off there from Duomo on the yellow line, and you take a train that goes, or there's one train that goes towards San Donato and the other one goes towards the other direction, Ospedale Maggiore. There's a video at one point and there's no sign on that video, so you have to go on about 15 meters through the pathway, through the hallway, to see what direction the metro is going in. When it's obvious that where there is a split in the line, you need to have some kind of an indication, right? You need to know, people need to know which way you're going, because they're foreigners, people who don't live in this city. Some people are very in a hurry, right? They don't have time to look around too much. And this lack of information in signage already creates tension in people, right? And irritability. And then there are four more. Two things will also distinguish between each other based on the direction. So if something is vertical, it's one thing. It will be different from something that is horizontal. Also the letters in the alphabet, for example, if you have to get glasses, for example, they will show you these letters, right? And they will also show you diagonal ones, so N, Z, for example, for astigmatism. So also these small aspects of the direction, orientation of an element, of an object, have to be considered, right? And the direction, therefore, the orientation. These are the main orientations of an object, and you can see that our capacity of selecting is higher towards the left than towards the right, normally. Then another element is the texture of something, so the characteristics of the surface of an object, whether it is smooth, satinated, rough, with the various sensorial experiences. This is very important because it really relates your sight with your sense of touch, and people are very much linked to this relationship between sight and touch, right? Because in fact, if you go to museums, you will always see this sign, also we have paintings, where it says "Do not touch." right? And an object that is made to be seen, to be looked at, is something that people naturally want to touch, like a painting, right? So this aptic act, this tendency we have towards the tactile use of our body and of our sight, it seems almost like our visual perception is not enough for us, right? But we have to accompany it with our sense of touch to be complete. So this is called an exteroplastic aspect. And then we have hue, and you see that hue is what we call red, green, yellow, and so on. It's not really the color, right? This is the hue in reality. So if you take a French book, for example, they call it tonality in French, okay, which is something else. Something that I never really talk about because the students get bored and so on. Could be something that could be interesting, could be a comment on the terms, the glossary that is used in the study of color in a certain profession, the terms that we use to define certain things. Could be useful, could be interesting to do a lesson on that. So the word color, for example, is made up of three things. It's made up of hue, which can be red, yellow, orange, blue, and so on. It's made up of the lightness, as if we were, or the value is also called, as if we would photograph black and white, the hues, and then it's made up of the saturation or chroma. These are three main perceptive components that, if you put them together, will make up what we call color, okay? But if you look only at red, green, yellow, and so on, in reality that is the hue. And finally we have the shape, okay, as a final element. All of these 8 elements, as you see, can be examined one by one, or 2 by 2, or 3 by 3, 4 by 4, and you will see that there are an infinite amount of combinations. However, there is one method of analysis for this, or a grid by means of which you can combine these elements and also examine. So, for example, also before you design something in social communication, right? You always have to look at the place where you have to, that you're designing for, and the things that you identify in that place. You have to, let's say that there is a system by which the great variety of data that you can collect in a model that will allow you to codify whatever you've collected in a uniform way, right? You have to put them in a model and make them uniform. And then here in the bottom you have all of them together, so either the first and the last, or all of them together. So there's like a frame by means of which you can examine, I don't know, a book, a manifesto, a poster, but especially I would say these things which have to do with social communication, like signage. So you can't really examine a painting with these characteristics, right? There you would use other components that you can use to analyze a work of art. But wherever you have communication which can be objectified, there you could use this grid, which is very useful for that, for analyzing those kinds of works. And also I want to underline that color is one of the variables that is together with these. So some of them are always present. Sometimes others are sometimes present and sometimes not. But color alone does not exist. Remember my first question, does color exist? And I said no. Do colors exist? Yes. Right? So here we go back to our starting point.
Allora, un altro elemento.
So another element Another element that is not found in books that give you a basic view about color, but only when you reach the second or third level in the study of color, So, is this element here, this topic, which are the ways of appearance of the color, and this is also a very interesting topic for design, I think, the ways that color appears. That means that a certain color can take on different values, which can be semantic or perceptive or psychological values, depending on the situations where you find that color. This means that if I have this notebook, for example, what color would you say that is? It's red. Okay. Is it red to all of you? We will accept it's red. This, I am now, for example, putting this under a device that can detect, an electronic device that can detect color, and that will give me a certain characteristic, and will say maybe this red is made up of the following colors, primary colors, fundamental colors rather than primary. And it might say, okay, it's made with these following components. And the same red, if it is on a pullover instead of a notebook, for example, then that machine will not distinguish this color from the color on the pullover. But for you, a red on wool, so on something that is soft to the touch, something that is aptic, that you can feel as soft, with a texture that is related to the weaving, or the knitting in that case, of wool, is not the same as a red that is on a notebook, which is different from a semantic and perceptive point of view. You would agree, right? So, one same color can have the same physical characteristics that might be detected by the device, but it is experienced in a different way depending on where it is. So the ways of appearance of the color are the following. Okay? This is how they have been classified. Or we might say, from the technological point of view, we have two options. We have RGB for the screen, this is how the three colors exist, or CMYK for the printer, or on a full surface or with dots, depending on whether it is applied on the object or on the eye. And the same way, you could say that also the way of appearance, the fundamental ways of appearance of color are three. This is the volume color. Okay, that means that it's a color that has a certain transparency. It's a thickness, right? So, for example, a bottle with a slightly colored liquid, you will feel where the color is in all of the thickness of the bottle. You couldn't say that it's only on the label, for example. You couldn't say it's like this, right, which is on the whole surface of the notebook. The color of the sea, for example, where is the color of the sea? Well, it's in all of the depth of the sea, right? This light blue color of a bathtub full of water, where would that be? In the whole thickness of the water. So this is the volume color, right? This is an experience that is a very deep experience, because it calls back our amniotic experience, which is when we were in our mother's womb. Okay, so this is a color that you can enter into almost, that you can immerse yourself into. It's in the entire thickness of something. So, for example, leather, wool, the softer wool is, and the more you can feel that it is really drained in that color, like as if it were a sponge, right? For example, in the sponge, where would you feel that the color is? Everywhere, right? Or in the sand, where's the color of sand? So this is an extraordinary experience, this experience of volume color. And especially children get great pleasure from plunging themselves into these perceptive experiences. Okay, it's the color you feel on your skin almost. An object that wets you all over, that just, you can plunge yourself into, get inside of. So the volume color requires that behind you should be able to see something so that you feel the thickness. For example, the color of the sea is not really a volume because I can't see the bottom of the sea. If, on the other hand, I had, a sheet or a bottle, for example, filled with liquid or a block of ice, and behind that I'm able to slightly perceive another object, then I will feel the thickness, I will perceive the thickness, and I will perceive that the color takes up all of the thickness or volume of the object. So we need a minimum of transparency to get volume color. Then from the volume color, so that's the color that is in the entire thickness of an object, if I come up, I get to the surface, and that's this color I see here. Right? This we perceive as a color, a bit hard color, something you cannot enter into or plunge into. It is a smooth color that will not allow you to... It's difficult to think that the whole notebook is red, for example, but if this were a sponge, or maybe straw, we would feel that that red is also going inside the object. So when from the depth we get to the surface, we call it surface color, which is another very important experience because it allows you in general to assess the distance of things, right? The color that is attached to something, right? It's almost pushed against something, pressed against something. And what happens then, the third state, is that this color from being very deep becomes a thin film or a thin surface. And before the 1960s, for example, painting would be searching for flesh, right? Painters, when they were looking for models, but also sculptors, not just painters. And when they looked for models, they would search for the amount of light that would enter the skin color. And after the 1960s, when you went from the colors in tubes to the colors in small cans, and you had these big brushes, color became a skin, not the flesh, but the skin. So it became a surface color, just like this. Okay. Now, of course, it's easy to imagine the process, right? We're going from the depth to the surface, and then the third stage is detaching yourself from the surface, and then you get this film color, right? Which is like the color of the sky. What distance is that color at, do you think, the sky? Well, it's no longer a thickness, it's no longer a surface, it's a kind of a veil or the experience is in fact very beautiful and difficult to actually carry out in terms of a project, although I've seen a couple of lamps made like this, but anyway, if you have a reduction shield, for example, and you make a hole, and then you look at a colored surface, a uniform colored surface, right? Let's say brown, for example, and you look at it through that hole, then the brown, which is here, so attached to the floor, will become a small thin film inside my hole, right? So it's almost as if it's detaching from the floor and attaching itself to this hole that I've made here. So it's almost the purest form of color that we get that way. It's like the skin or the shell of an egg. It's like that paper you draw on, the almost transparent paper. So it's an element where you lose distance. But it's this tactile experience, very light, very consistent experience, that allows you to look at a uniform surface and see the color almost detaching from the surface and coming up towards that hole. So I saw this, for example, with these lamps that I was just mentioning, where I saw people actually going to touch with their finger because they thought that it was glass or something. So it's almost as if the color is detached from the object, from the surface of the object. So the three main situations we can have are these, right? The volume color, the surface color, and the film color. Here's that shield that I was telling you about with the hole. And another situation, we have three secondary situations as well, right? Just like we have three secondary colors, the structural color could be, and this is also very beautiful because this is the color we have in soap bubbles, for example. Microsonic colors, for example. You know, the one with the also the color of the feathers of birds. It's a color that is in between surface and light. So it's like a color that changes depending on the inclination. Then we have the reflection color. In fact, anyway, this is also very nice experience. For example, if you have this surface and you hide it, and behind it you have a surface, a white surface, then that color from the first surface will reflect on the white surface. So it's not really a light, it's not really a matter, it's just a reflection. And many projects use this kind of a situation physically. So this would be the reflected color. And then we have the illumination color. And this is a color that you can imagine, for example, in here, if everything was lit up with blue lights or red lights or green lights, right? So the light that is sent out has a color. So then you would see that all of the colors in this room, all the objects in this room would change color. Some of them would keep the color, others would change. But you would see that this color fills up the whole environment, the whole space of the room. And then we have colored light, okay, which is the source color. And these are 7 situations where a color can exist. Even if an electronic device would not be able to tell the difference between one and the other. For the machine, these colors would all be the same because they measure only the wavelength or the frequency or the electrowarp. So these are the 3 elements that you can technically use to measure the components of a color. So in those terms, the colors would be the same. So I think also this is an element that you should consider. And I wrote down several things here, but I think we won't have time to mention all of them today. You have 6 more minutes. But you're pretty much fed up, probably, so... Another element that influences color is the type of margin that this color can present. So I don't think I have anything to show you, Sorry, I didn't do my homework. I didn't bring in that material to show you. But it's the following concept. If you have... we're getting this example, an example from Kranitsa, but the grammar of sight. You have, let's say, a disc, a colored disc, green or black or blue, and with a margin, a very clean cut, very clear margin. And then the same color in another disc with a more faded edge of the color. In the first case, with the clear-cut margin, the color will be immediately perceived. It's like a surface color like this. While in the other case, with the faded margins, not only will we have blurred edges, but also the inside will seem very soft, almost like velvet. Okay? So the margins, the edges, have produced a perceptive situation due to which not only, while the first one was very black, for example, the second one with the blurred edges is perceived as slightly gray. So first of all, it changes in lightness and appearance, but also in terms of texture and tactile perception, it changes. The first is perceived as very clear, very metallic, and the second is perceived as softer. Okay, so you can enter into the color. So there is a passage that goes from the surface color towards a color that we could say is not yet a volume color really, because I would like to introduce, although I don't have that authority, but the color, volume color and surface color, when the thickness is between this experience that characterized humanity, the experience of opposition of fingers, right? When you have a very small thickness like this that can fit between your fingers, then that is a thickness that should also be classified as meaningful. So I think you can see also with cars, for example, how with time something that was a surface color on a car, so a covering color, if after certain operations, the color tends to go more into depth. So it's no longer a strong surface color, but it becomes a color which becomes thick. It has a thickness to it, a volume. And all of these are elements that enrich our perception. And that's why a course on color, before it should be addressed at designing, when you're in a school and not in a design office, this course should develop these attentions and these linguistic enrichments, because the audience or the students might not notice, but it's not necessarily true that they don't perceive the communicative qualities of this. So if you want to ask me any questions or anything I should explain, otherwise we will see each other again in the next meeting. Now, I've only mentioned some things. I had written down about 30 things to talk about, but I only mentioned a few of these situations that give you a kind of a general overview of the kind of studies that have been made about color. Let's say the most basic studies and also the second level studies. Then the higher level studies, of course, become even more specialized and detailed. But this was just to give you an overview of the linguistic richness of this means of communication. And I think in order to look at that, you have to examine these first 30 items, which I mentioned only 6 or 7 of. But anyway, we've started to approach the study of color. Okay, so if you want to ask me anything, any questions? All right, so see you next time.